So today, we're coming to the third commandment. And just right away, before we talk about anything else, I just want us to read it together in Exodus chapter 20, verse 7, which says this: "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." So I want you to imagine for a moment that you're sitting at just at a large gathering. Okay, maybe it's a wedding reception or some kind of like corporate event or conference or something. Basically, the room is just like buzzing with conversation. You hear laughter, clinking of glasses. Now suddenly you hear someone call out your name. Not just your first name, but your full name. How do you react to that? If you're like most people, you'd probably snap to attention, right? Your ears would perk up, your head would turn around, you'd be looking for who called my name? Well, why? Because there's power in a name, especially when it's your name, because names aren't just labels that we just slap on things, right? But they carry weight, they carry identity, they carry authority, they carry relationship. I mean, think about how differently you might react if you heard someone just call out like, "Oh, hey, you," versus someone calling out your full name. Or maybe consider, how a child's demeanor changes when a parent uses their full name, right? Like, "Austin Wayne Duncan, come here right now." That carries a weight that just Austin simply doesn't. And see, this is the backdrop against which we need to understand the third commandment. See, when God says, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain," he's not just talking about vocabulary. Okay, he's talking about identity, he's talking about authority, he's talking about relationship. He's talking about how we carry his name in the world. And so I want to dive deeper into the language of this commandment. See, in Hebrew, the word that's used here for the word take in our verse saying, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain," that Hebrew word is nashah, which means to lift or to carry. And this verb, it's used all throughout the Old Testament, and when it's usually used being to describe a burden or carrying a load or even like raising one's voice, for example. In fact, in Psalm 24, verse 4, it's used to describe someone who has not, quote, lifted up their soul to an idol. And so a more literal translation might be, instead of "you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain," it might be "you shall not lift up or carry the name of the Lord your God in vain." And the reason I point this out right away into this video is because it gives us a much richer understanding of what God is doing here. See, it's not just about saying certain words. Okay, it's not just about avoiding certain words. It's about how we bear God's name in every aspect of our lives. It's about how we represent him to the world. I mean, think about this. Think about the concept of carrying someone's name today. For example, like when an ambassador goes to a foreign country, what are they doing? They're carrying the name of their nation with them, and their actions and their words, they're a reflection of the country that they're representing. And so in a similar way, we carry God's name as his ambassadors in this world. I'm just making that up. That's from 2 Corinthians 5:20. And so continuing though in the Hebrew here, the word translated as vain is shav. So when you get, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain," that word vain in Hebrew is shav, and it carries connotations of just emptiness or falsehood. In fact, it's the same word that's used in Psalm chapter 127, if I can find it for us. In Psalm 127, verse 1, there we go, which says this: "Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain." So essentially what God is saying here in this commandment, in this third commandment, is he's saying this: don't carry my name in a way that is empty, meaningless, or false. Now, again, it's so important also when we're reading through this, to do so in context, and that context also includes the historical context. See, in ancient Israel, names, they were far more than just identifiers, right? More than just getting someone's attention at an event. More than a way to tell someone that they're in trouble just by using their full name, as I've heard in my life. But no, they were tied to one's nature, to their character, and to their authority. Right? Think of how Jacob's name, which meant supplanter or heel grabber, it was changed to Israel, which means he struggles with God after his wrestling match with God in Genesis 32:28. Or think about how Naomi wanted to be called Mara, which means bitter, because of her experiences in Ruth chapter 1. See, this concept of a name being more than just some way to call on someone, it's especially true of God's name. Remember the story of Moses in the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. When Moses asks God for his name, God responds with what? I am who I am. And as we talked about in the very first commandment of this series, which I'll link in the video description and up here as well, as we talked about in the very first week, in Hebrew, it's closely related. This I am who I am, it's closely related to the name Yahweh, which appears actually over 6,800 times in the Old Testament. And this name, it represents God's eternal, self-sufficient nature. Okay, it's not just a label, but rather, in and of itself, the name is a revelation of who God is. It's a name that it encompasses all of God's attributes. It encompasses His holiness, His sovereignty, His unchanging nature. In fact, the Israelites, they considered God's name just so sacred that they developed a practice of not even pronouncing it. When they came across, the way it was written was YHWH, Yod-He-Wahi. In Hebrew, when they came across that YHWH in Scripture, they would substitute it with Adonai, meaning Lord. And this practice, it continues in a way in many of our English translations today. And in these translations, you see it in the spots where you see the word Lord in all caps. That represents the divine name, YHWH. And see, this reverence for God's name, it extended to how they viewed God's presence. In fact, in the tabernacle and later in the temple, these places, they were seen as the place where God's name dwelt. We learn this from Deuteronomy 12:5. And so to profane or to disrespect the temple was to profane or to disrespect God's name. So given the original language that we just discussed and what's being said there, and taking into account how the Israelites historically viewed names, hopefully we can now see that when God commands us not to take His name in vain, He's saying, basically, don't treat lightly what is of the utmost importance. Don't misrepresent who I am. Don't claim my authority for your own purposes. See, His commandment, it's more than just a do not right here in the Bible, but rather it's a challenge for us to consider how we're carrying God's name in our daily lives. And it carries this element for us to consider things like this, like, are we representing God accurately as Christians out in the world? Are we representing Him accurately? Are we treating His name, are we treating His very essence with the reverence that it deserves? Or maybe a better question is, are we living in a way that brings honor to God's name?